Do you know what a financialist killchain is, or how it's going to be the end of nations? Well, it's time for you to join me and my guest, EM Burlingame, on The David Rutherford Show. As a person that is pretty much consumed with what's taken place on X and Instagram and all of the other, monologues and dialogues that are taking place every single day, and the explosion of kind of this historical relevance that we're seeing emerge on the internet, from the Martyr Made podcast to revisionist history podcasts. So all of this, I find myself really trying to get focused on individuals that seem to have a real understanding and grasp of the details of history, not just, to synthesize it or give a glossy overview. And so as I was preparing to go on Dan Holloway's show, the Citizen Podcast, which I highly recommend for everybody, it's a great show. I was doing my research. I came across a gentleman named EM Burlingame, and who, obviously you look at his resume, former Green Beret, he's a researcher, he's an author, I started following him. And what I quickly began to realize was that his grasp and understanding of history is not only impeccable, but it's absolute. It provokes such a deeper sense of thinking that it sucked me into where I was like waking up every day and I was thinking to myself, man, I want more. And then I started commenting, and next thing you know, we started chatting, and he started feeding me a lot of his stuff that's on his website on emburlingame.com and his writings. And I really began to go, wow, this guy has a deeper understanding that I really want to share with my audience. So EM, man, it is such a privilege to have you on. I'm really excited about digging into the Financialist Killchain article you wrote. And so thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, it's my pleasure. I don't generally engage with people very often other than a small group, but the things that you were putting up and your commentary on it was like, okay, well, this is a guy that he gets it certainly more than most of the soft guys, but more than a lot of the other pundits as well. So, well,
thank you. One of I think the difficult things that, I talk about often with my other friends is, there's a representation of our communities that, are putting out really interesting content. And it's, I think it's a lot of what people want to see and want to hear, whether it's, the team room stuff or it's the tactical evaluation stuff or whatever. But what my favorite are when guys actually, are able to utilize their experiences in the world that we come from as a conduit for opening their consciousness to a much more, what would be the right word? A much more hard reality to the fact of the roles we actually play in geopolitics. I'll never forget when I first my only combat deployment in the teams in the summer of 2002, when I used to believe that I was, the tip of the spear, and I was out there and I was going to change the course of history. And next, and I realized, well, not only am I, a pawn, not a pawn on this, chessboard of a million infinite chessboards playing a game I don't understand with rules that aren't really the rules, but I was actually like a piece of lint on the felt underneath the pawn. And I, finding other people that are able to deliver that without demeaning the significance of the communities that we come from, the historical relevance in the work of our compatriots who've really in the individual way have done remarkable things, but are still able to take a step back and go, whoa, there's a much bigger picture here going on. So you're that guy for me.
Well, I think maybe perhaps because I had an unusual path into SOF. I didn't get there till I was in my 40s. I had my 42nd birthday, the second day of selection.
Oh my gosh.
The first time I went to selection, because I separated my right shoulder, had to go back about 7 months later and finally did get selected. But I already been in tech. I'd already been in Silicon Valley. I'd already been an investment banker, and I'd been oriented around technology mostly. I've been in the yacht business for a little bit as a chief financial officer in Europe. So in Monaco, and so I'd had and then I had a very unique mother in childhood. So I'd had a lot of this kind of experience. I went into SOF because there was some dynamics I didn't understand that I couldn't get in the books, that I couldn't get in the conversations with, the community I came from and engaged with. And I was also looking in financial data when I was doing analysis and due diligence for investments around the world, and things didn't add up. It's, what was being articulated by the best financial information companies and OSINT companies, et cetera, at the time didn't match up to what was going on in the world. And then you'd see even the best analysts were not able to make the right analysis. Well, it was like, okay, well, something's wrong with the baseline frontline data. I need to get out there in the world and outside of the, curated safety bubble of an investor in some part of the world. And the only way to do that was and in a certain mission set. I was like, okay, well, the only guys I know that do that are the Green Berets, specifically the DIME mission, diplomacy, information, military, economics, right? Mm-hmm. And then increasingly the finance, intelligence, and law enforcement, or legal as well. Mm-hmm. And so I'd already had a bit of a life before, which gave me a little bit of a different perspective, substantive. And then I had an immense amount to learn about SOF itself and its mission and the people. And then there was the same thing. It was like, okay, well, we're out doing work, but the data doesn't match up to what we're being told.
That's right.
The intelligence doesn't match up. And then I was involved in writing some of the intelligence reports. And then I go back into the certain database of databases later on, a year or 2 years later, and what I'd written that's not what we wrote. Somebody had edited that before it finally got accepted, right? So then I started going, I wonder how much that's been happening in history. Right? It's like,
exactly.
I wonder how, and then it's like, okay, but so why is that happening? Well, I'd had some time in algorithmic high frequency trading before I went in late 2008. And I would look at as I went into the targeting side of things, mm-hmm. With the SIF, and it was interesting who we were allowed to look at for targeting and who was actually being exercised. And as you know, that's not always kill. More often than not, it's, if not capture, co-opt in some other way to get them working for you, right? But it was like, mm-hmm. who were we actually? Who was the tier one guys and the equivalent tier one local assets actually exercising, and why them? Well, it sure turned out a whole lot of times that if you talk to the threat finance guys, you'd find out why. And it had something to do with moving some stock in some exchange, some market around the world for 3 or 4 days. So algorithmic trading guys could make $1 billion or so.
Yep. That is, those are the things that kind of hit you like a ton of bricks. For me, the big one was when I left the teams, I went to work for Blackwater, right? And my second gig, first gig was working in Azerbaijan for about 10 months. And our job was to design and implement a maritime interdiction program for the Caspian. And what ended up coming out was it's essentially some type of reconnaissance mission for the nuclear material that's moving north and south, from Russia into Iran. And then the next one was doing training counter-drug commandos in Afghanistan, which is the greatest, the greatest irony on the planet, when after the second op I was mentoring on, and it was the second drug lord we tried to take down and there was nobody there, right? And so that's for me all of a sudden, and I'm just a kid still, and I thought I had understand a little bit of the world, but now all of a sudden things really start to unfold for me. And by the time I went to work for the agency, it was a whole different ball game. At that time, I was kind of awoken to the real complexities of how all of this stuff is interlaced. And that's why I think, the content that you're putting out is so critical to help people understand the depths of these, maybe, these playbooks, if you will, right? These are frameworks that have been in place, not for, strictly post World War II or post Vietnam or even the modern GWAT. I mean, these are playbooks that have been around for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And so what I was hoping you could do today is just introduce, that one article, The Evolution of the Financialist Killchain. And you could explain what that financialist killchain is, and then the history of this story. So we can get people to try to start to think in a grander scale about how all of this stuff is interrelated.
Yeah. So maybe we walk through the 7 steps of the kill chain itself. Mm-hmm. And a little background, just to give you, in the 90s, I did corporate restructuring. This was after the leveraged buyout days of the 80s, where junk bonds, cheap, the equivalent of cheap free money at the time, like qualitative easy now, built the private equity industry. Back in the 80s
Gordon
and 90s,
Gekko days.
The Gordon greed is good, right? Yeah. The KKR days, so a good number of the billionaires that we have today were made in the leveraged buyout days, right? The non-tech oligarch ones. So on the other side of that, in the 90s, we had to fix all those problems. We had to, because all of it was it was one of the first great fleecings. Okay. It took all of these private companies, right? All these assets, all these private companies, slammed them together in these big conglomerates, raised massive amounts of debt to make those acquisitions, floated junk bonds to get people to pay for it, and IPOs. All of which, though, 80+% of the proposed value of these, break everything up, bring everything together into big, massive conglomerate companies, centralize everything, all these, value unlocking things that were sold to raise all this debt and junk paper and to dump these onto the public markets was all a lie. It was never intended for that. It was intended for the fees that were made in the process and the wealth that people made in the markets by taking wealth from retirement funds that were increasingly legally allowed to invest in the stock markets. Okay. In the 90s, we had to fix all those problems, or many of those problems. And unfortunately, we couldn't fix a whole lot, but there was things we could do. Well, recently, and I don't know why I didn't think about this before, but maybe it just wasn't part of the path, as I started to realize, well, that happens at the level of nations. Mm-hmm. Principalities, dukedoms, earldoms, baronets, that this has been going on for a very, very long time. And the Westphalian world model put in place in the 1600s is what really instantiated this in all of the West at every level. So maybe we talk the kill chain and keep in mind that it's both corporations, banks, so this is playing out in the business and industry and finance, but it's also happening at the state level, at the nation state level. Okay. With the same financialist behind it all. So the first step is infiltration and influence. So the financialists embed themselves in a country's leadership, posing as advisors or allies. What the hell is the WEF? The World Economic Forum? Yep. right?
The stakeholder, right? It's the stakeholder initiative.
Yeah, right. So, what was Operation Maxwell Epstein really? Wasn't about kids. That was just a mechanism. And there's all kinds of other ways to compromise people and to get them onto, right? So that's the infiltration and influence. Then there's debt entrapment. They push unsustainable loans, locking nations into repayment cycles. What was the whole climate crisis thing? The whole climate, you know, you got to invest all of this money, you know, cities, counties, states, and nations had to invest, you know, or create municipal bonds that the financialists could buy and trade so that you could raise the debt so that you could roll out this new infrastructure, right? And everything related and all kinds of other things, but that's one that comes to top of my mind. In the process, what are you doing? You're identifying assets, right? You're identifying the assets in that country or in that company or that corporation, because now you're on the inside. Now you got people on the inside. Now you have, you know, you're trying to expand upon what you're doing. You're bringing more people in who get paid off a little bit or make some money or some career or whatever it is. But what you're really doing inside of all of there is you're identifying assets of value to you. And you're figuring out, how can I gain access to that asset? Because what do the financialists need more than anything else? They need collateral.
Right.
Because you've got to have collateral for debt. They don't create anything ever. So they have to find assets that others have created and established, and in the form of states, nation states, that's infrastructure.
Wow.
That's utilities.
That's your commodities, right? That's the stuff that comes out of the ground. That's your rare earth mine.
But it's also revenue bases for power generation. So it's your utilities. It's your so power generation, gas. So it's also tax bases, right? So San Francisco, for the financialists, that's an asset. That's a revenue generator, right? So you sell bonds to build up or improve your revenue generating utilities. Those bonds are purchased by the financiers. They're paid off by the taxpayers. Or they're secured and guaranteed by the tax base. Right? What is the U.S. national debt? The U.S. national debt is using the United States tax base as an asset, as a collateralized asset in the form of that debt is collateral. It's why treasuries are the most secure collateral in the world, the most sought after collateral in the world. Why? Because it's backed up by the ability of the United States to enforce people to pay tax. Through the use of violence.
That's the key, right? Don't pay your taxes, get a knock on the door. Go to jail.
Lose everything.
How the pension funds integrated into there?
Right. So that's through, management of BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, et cetera. That's another mechanism whereby those funds in the retirement funds is collateral as well.
That's what I thought.
Funds under management can be used as collateral. Now, it should be illegal, and it was until 1994 Deregulation Act. So, but all of these things are collateralized assets. Now, there are some strictures, limitations on the ability to how do you enforce the payment or the acquisition of collateral? And there are some limitations on the retirement stuff, but not much. That's that whole bail-in thing, right? The great taking stuff that the gentleman whose name escapes me right now, but who's very brilliant about all that, articulates. That's what that is. It's the mechanisms whereby, should they need to expend that collateral, they have the mechanisms through the banks and other things, the hypothecation system, et cetera, to take that asset, right?
Right. So,
assets, valuable resources, land, industry, tax bases, infrastructure, retirement funds, et cetera. Now, there's they don't necessarily, because everything they do is on debt, right? Everything that they do is based off of debt and fees. fees earned. There's various ways in which they get their fees. They don't always want to cash out that asset. That's not always in their best interest, especially if they went after retirement funds, et cetera. There'd be a revolution.
Right.
But for as long as they can use it as many ways as they can, they're going to use that as a collateralized asset that gains them access to other things, other countries, other states, bigger investments, big corporations. And a prime example of this is BlackRock. It's exactly what BlackRock does. With something like tens of billions on its own books, it manages tens of trillions. Right. Okay. So that's step 3. The third step is, and they're constantly doing step 3, which is asset identification, constantly. And that's natural resources, in countries, locations, it's all kinds of things. So anything that could be used as collateral for lending and debt, or for the refinancing of old debts, which is a lot of what happens, right? Okay. Economic destabilization is step 4. That's where the markets are manipulated to deepen a crisis, right? Sometimes there's pulsing of that destabilization so that they can liquidate some assets, they can liquidate some positions, they can roll over debt at a lower rate, right? All these kinds of things. But ultimately, the ability of that to compensate for the theft of productivity, the theft of real asset value improvement into the financialist system can't be compensated for anymore. And so that destabilization is constantly woven in there. So because later they're going to have to do step 7. So step 5 is debt for asset swaps. This is the pulsing, right? They'll pulse and someone won't be able to pay the debt. And so the financialist will come in with capital and they'll buy that asset at a discounted rate.
At a discounted rate. Wow.
Right. So asset seized in exchange for debt relief. And this, we've seen this not just in corporations, but in, municipalities. Right. Water. So there's the Sumerians talked about hydraulic despotism thousands of years ago. And hydraulic despotism is if you can control the flow of water, you control a people.
Right. Damming, right?
Damming, diversion. So the hydraulic despotism beyond that also includes agriculture. It includes fuel for cooking, for other things. It includes electricity today.
Blotting out the sun.
Blotting out this. Right. So it's all of it collectively is called hydraulic despotism because of the earlier. But if you control, so when they do their debt for asset swaps, the assets that they go after are the ones that support hydraulic despotism in all of its forms.
Got it.
Okay. Or which provide revenues. But if you see them, and sometimes those are the same because they're your utilities and other things, right? But generally, when they go for a swap, an actual hard collateral for debt swap, they go for assets that give, not generally, always give them more power. Or sometimes they'll go after assets that they can flip at a higher value to somebody else that they already know about. Or as what's happened, turned out to be in the leveraged buyout days of the 70s and 80s, into the early 90s, a lot of the companies they went after had cash. Right? They had cash
because
reserves.
Cash is king, and they want that cash.
Correct. So it turned out what happened starting in the 90s is companies didn't keep very much cash anymore. They just kept it in convertibles and debt, et cetera. So, which unfortunately made them even more susceptible. All right. So number 6 is extraction and exploitation. Wealth is drained through profit extraction. That's what I'm saying. They take the asset through a debt swap in its various complex forms, and they sell that to somebody else, or they put it into a fund, right? Private equity fund, hedge fund, whatever. Excuse me. So that they can continue to benefit from the revenues generated by it. Or they'll put it into they'll put it into a trust or a fund or some kind of an account that then they can use it as collateral to leverage up 10, 20, 100 times through hypothecation, et cetera, right? The whole purpose, however, is to extract as much value out of it for as long as they can.
Right.
Okay. All right. And then to exploit it. And then final stage, which they have to do. Okay. The final stage is a step 7, which is abandonment and collapse. They have to, once they've extracted everything they can. And so you have to think of these like parasites.
Yep.
Like a virulent host killing parasite, because that's exactly the mind and the concept. The book I wrote, The Eternal War, goes into this, right?
I started that last week, by the way, and It's fascinating. Thank you.
Awesome. So they, at some point, they have to abandon, collapse, and move on. Now, they've already moved on by that point, right? But they have to abandon and collapse because the cost for them to maintain the illusion of a functioning whole system becomes too expensive. They don't want to carry it. They don't want to bury it. As well, they can't hide what they've done anymore.
Right.
So they have to do a collapse war, generally, or civil war, or failed narco state, et cetera. They have to do some kind of a collapse so that, or a genocide, so that you're so busy fighting each other and trying to survive that you can't look for and see what they've done. You can't go after them, right? You can't organize and coordinate to go after them and get wealth back from them. What wealth is possible? Like, not much, because how many people got their money back from Bernie Madoff?
None.
Right.
Or from what was the young kid who just did it again?
Bankman-Fried. Yeah.
Bankman-Fried.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just it's never ending. It's just one experience after the other. The challenging ones, I think, though, the scary ones that I think, the modern, I think more and more people are starting, especially with people like you going out there and explaining this in detail. But you're starting to realize that those catastrophic events of the 20th century were relative to this procedure, right? Were relative to this.
Oh, they weren't relative. They're the direct result of this.
The direct
procedure.
result. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Absolutely.
Yeah. So when you look back through history to where does this start? 1,000 years ago. Well, maybe about 700 years ago in Venice. Starts in Venice with the bankers in Venice who invented modern banking. And oh, by the way, no, it's not the Jews. I'm tired of hearing the whole, it's the Jews.
It seems like such a sloppy argument nowadays. But
I mean, they got their people and they're doing their thing, and I get it. So is everybody else. But to think that, purely European peoples haven't been screwing one another over in absolutely ludicrously clever ways for thousands of years before we ever even heard of a thing called a Jew is like stupid as hell.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
But the codification of these things go back earlier, right? Because you can hear about them in Egyptian histories and Sumerian histories and Babylonian histories and in, who did... I think the Jesus guy threw over the tables of the money changers in the temple and all that stuff, right? Yep. So this stuff goes back way further, but when it comes to Europe and Europe specifically, in the post-Roman Empire time, it really, this never-ending constant cycle of, 7-step process really took off in the 13th century in Venice. And then it's just gone from there to Amsterdam, from Amsterdam to London, from London to Wall Street. They tried to take it to China next. China said, no, you are not doing this. And so what's the next step, right? Where do they go from here?
Can you drill down on the jump from Venice to Amsterdam? Because what you think about, I mean, obviously every time you hear about the Venetian power, right? You think about the Medicis, you think about those people that were able to consolidate post-Roman collapse and power through the shipping industries. but from Venice to Amsterdam seems like a weird jump. Can you explain that a little bit to people? Like I at first, like when I was reading, I was like, whoa, that's weird. But when you started getting into the East India Trading Company, that's when I was like, oh, that makes sense now.
Yeah. So, one, they're both swamps. So, they keep talking about drain the swamp in DC. I mean, it's the same people. It's like, wow, maybe there is something to the actual swamp. And it goes back way before the fact that the DC itself was an actual literal swamp, right? It's like, no. So was Amsterdam, and it was a marsh swamp, and so was Venice. And, anyways.
That's fascinating. I never even thought about it like that.
Yeah, these are swamp creatures. Yeah. Not aliens, they're not lizard people, etc. They're swamp creatures
with their tongues and their
No disrespect to my swamp friends, my Cajun swamp friends down in Louisiana.
That's right.
Y'all a different breed. Yeah,
they are. My first platoon lieutenant. My AOIC, my first platoon was from Baton Rouge, and just different cut, man. Just a different cut.
Those Cajuns are different folk.
Yeah, they are.
Did you ever see that movie Southern Comfort when you were a kid?
With Carradine and his brother, and then Booth. What's his name? God, I love that movie. I love that. That's cool.
Yeah. So the Venetians build up a sea empire, right? A minor sea empire. But what really made the Venetians successful was that initially they had Byzantium there as the shield, right, on their eastern flank. And what really made them successful is they innovated financially. And promissory notes, bills of lading, factoring, so they were doing very clever financial things, probably borrowing from the concepts and ideas of the Templars, which is maybe where some of the, commingling of those ideas, because they all had to go through that area to go fight in the Holy Land.
Right.
Which I wonder sometimes how fucking holy it is. Excuse my language. If everybody's
That's another show. We'll do that.
Yeah. Well, just everybody's fighting over. But point is that the Venetians, because of the conflicts that were in the area and where they were and the type of business they were doing, they innovated financially that allowed them to be very, very successful as I don't want to say minor, but at the time, kind of a minor sea power. Historically, they weren't a minor power. That would, their reach and everything else was pretty substantial. When the Ottomans took over, when the Ottomans, finally breached Constantinople and began to take in, lock and control the Ionian Sea, etc., the Venetian Empire, the Venetians were starting to spend way too much money just on safety, security, bribes, everything. It was just too costly for them, and the Venetian Empire started to decline. Well. Shipping powers, the big ships, the first galleon-like ships, weren't in Venice. They were in Holland and Portugal and Spain, then the other side of the Mediterranean and then up, et cetera. Well, the place that welcomed them, that was a natural fit for them, just geographically, just everything they'd known for centuries was Amsterdam, was Holland. Amsterdam and Holland was also very business oriented, right? Very commercial oriented. It was mercantilist. It was already mercantilist. It was a natural fit. And it already had fairly good bankers, but the Venetians brought a whole lot more sophistication with them, and they helped charter the Dutch East India Company and finance and bankroll it and greatly improve upon the success of the Dutch East India Company, such that within a few years, it surpassed the British East India Company in success and capabilities. And primarily they did that, were able to do that now as Dutch bankers, not Venetian bankers anymore, but Dutch bankers. Well, in their intervening time, the Venetian bankers had figured out this kill chain and had been using it in the eastern parts of the Mediterranean and in some of the principalities, in continental Europe. So they'd already been embedding that kill chain in parts of northern Africa, the Levant, and elsewhere. So they get to Amsterdam in the 16th century, and they start spreading it now back down across the continent the other way. There was one state, one group of states and islands, though, that said, yeah, no. And that was the British Isles.
Right. I hope you're enjoying this incredible conversation with EM Burlingame and I. But we have to pay tribute to our sponsors. And the one that just really makes me so happy to be part of and is really a derivative of my friendship with Alex and how much I really appreciate and love his family and his company, Firecracker Farms. If you love hot, spicy things and you like it, your food to have a little punch to it, then please go to firecracker.farm and check out their pepper-infused salt and these beautiful salt shakers. So that way you can spice up your meals like I do every single day. Man, my eggs have never been the same since I got myself some of their wonderful spiced salt, man. Again, check out firecracker.farm. When you go there, type in RUT15. That's Romeo Uniform Tango 15 for your discount. And you are going to have a whole new appreciation for spicy food. Booyah.
Right. And the British Isles had a very substantive fleet that was developed, that Henry VIII began, that Elizabeth continued. The Dutch went to war with the Spanish, with the Habsburgs, for 30 years, I think. The Dutch bankrolled and backed the 30 years, 80 years, and 100 years wars on the continent. So what happens in the 1600s is by the 1600s, everything's so hot on the continent. There's wars everywhere. They convened the Peace of Westphalia, which is two treaties, Innsbruck and Munster, 1645, 1649. And they, for all intents and purposes, ended feudalism and the rule of princes, which had been resisting them, and instantiated the kill chain into everything in every state in Europe. The ones that disagreed were the east of Poland and a few others, and they went to war with them for a century. It was getting too hot on the, because Holland's not very, or the Netherlands isn't very defensible. Mm-hmm. And so they needed to, again, just like from Venice, a century or so before, they needed to rebase. Well, there was these British Isles over there, and there were disloyal nobles in the British Isles, and they had bought parliamentarians, the step one influence, right? And they had been working with the Catholic Church, even though they're supposedly enemies, but they'd been working with the Catholic Church. They had a beef with the English because of Henry VIII. Who had kicked them out, and Henry VIII had kicked them out for this very reason. Henry VIII's ending Catholicism in the British Isles had nothing to do with marriage. That was ostensibly the argument. It was to try and prevent this banking kill chain from being embedded in the British Isles and the British kingdoms. Unfortunately, had there not been unseasonable storms, actually, and I forgot the year, 1640 something, or 1620, 1630, somewhere it went, but the nobles were trying to rally to His Majesty King Charles I to throw off the parliamentarians who had been bought off. And, so this whole hostile corporate takeover by the Dutch East India Company of the British East India Company, which was culminated many years later, but there were unseasonable rains. When the Civil War, the English Civil War, actually kicked off, the English Civil War, backed by the Dutch, and the Dutch bankers and all of that, who were looking to take the islands and then move their headquarters to London because it was safer, more secure. Okay. And an empire was starting to build up under the English, and the English had the manpower, and it had the ships, and it was a defensible redoubt, et cetera, et cetera.
It was a ripe host.
It was a ripe host, and it was, unfortunately, the Wars of the Roses did a serious number on the nobility. And, and the War of the Roses went on for quite some time. And then Henry, His Majesty King Henry VIII, and Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, or the First, and Queen Mary in between were all batshit insane. I mean, literally, certifiably insane. And so they had done a number on, the people, and then the breaking from Catholicism, and which was done again to try and actually prevent this kill chain from being embedded through the vector of the church, right? The Catholic Church.
Right.
Unfortunately, there's these unseasonable rains. The nobles couldn't get to London, so the king had to flee, and then the whole Civil War kicked off. Cromwell comes along later, and the Roundheads, and he thinks he's fighting, the kings and for parliamentarians and Puritans, etc. At a certain point, Cromwell realizes, holy cow, we're under invasion by the Dutch. And this is actually an attempt by a foreign power to, embed, to take over our nation and country. So Cromwell fought them for, till the day he died.
Right.
His son was supposed to replace him. Unfortunately, his son wasn't the man. And down underneath the English civilization, we're a monarchical people. We can say we don't like it, we don't believe in it, et cetera, but we elect a monarch every 4 years. So we can say, no, down with the king. It's like, you just voted for a king.
Yeah, man, that's about as poignant as anything I've heard in the last 8 years.
And not only the king, but, who are these other, senators and congressmen? You just voted for your duke and your baron and your, it's like, or your governors, like your duke. It's like, come on. Right? Down with princes. You vote for princes every 2 or 4 years. Shut the hell up. Anyways, the point is that once Cromwell's gone, there is no cohesion. There were 6 major lords, British lords. Well, it wouldn't be called British till later, but, English lords who betrayed the crown, betrayed the English because they wanted to change the power structure. And in 1688, William of Orange is brought over, married to a Stuart daughter, and they take the crown, backed with an army directly funded by the Dutch East India Company and the bankers. And then they take over, with their parliamentarians, everybody they've been buying off. The industrialists were all for it because the industrialists were building up on the Thames River there, et cetera. And they didn't want to be beholden to the king. They wanted to, they wanted the nobles' labor to work their factories. So they had to end nobility. They had to end aristocracy. They had to end any power. And when William came over, since 1688, no king that sat on the English throne has had any power.
That was it. That was the final.
Was done.
Because feudalism was over. Lands were no longer as relevant as they were. Those titles were worth.
Okay, so great. With the bankers and this financialist kill chain and this creation of artificial wealth, the financialist-backed parliamentarians, merchants, industrialists were able to generate vast fortunes, artificial wealth fortunes, and the nobility couldn't keep up because everything the nobility had to do had to be based in reality. Crops and lands and peoples and all of these complex spaces that the nobility had to maintain. They couldn't keep up with this artificial currency, financial manipulation, derivatives game. And I wrote another article I published yesterday about how the Venetians become the Dutch, become then the Bank of England, have for 700, 800 years intentionally, directly, substantively worked to remove hereditary princes everywhere, always, and to turn the people against their princes, because the only places where this kill chain didn't work until it did was those places where there was a strong prince, king, duke, baron, etc. But there was a strong
centralized leader, an individual centralized leadership that's rooted in its historical legacy. And its right. It's birthright.
Correct. And it met its obligations to its people, and because of that, it had the loyalty of its people. What do we call any one of these people now today? We call them a dictator.
Right.
A tyrant. Well, who's telling us that? Right? The very people that have been steadily working to remove princes because the princes are the only obstacle to the kill chain. And because they want all the assets of the prince as collateral. And they want the commons. That's the thing that's been destroyed the worst. And Peter Buffett, actually, Warren's son, sent me an article one day, or actually gave me an article one day from the New York Post, I think, from many years ago, 2013, I think. But it was about the theft of the commons.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So this kill chain.
That's almost like the theft of the middle class. The offshoring of the middle class, right?
It's exactly what it is.
It's the same thing.
Yes,
correct?
yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. The commons today, primarily the commons today, is retirement savings.
Okay.
Right? It's the financial commons. Yep. And they've stolen it 2008, stole it 2001. They're working on doing it again.
Yep.
Right. So in the modern era, the commons are people's shared retirement funds that are invested in the companies and assets of the country and nation.
Mm-hmm.
That's the commons. We all share common, in common, we share these things. This important, what is the product of our labor, our collective labor? It's our financial assets and our retirement funds. It's our collateral in our homes, etc. We all share that in these complex ways.
Mm-hmm.
And these financialists have been steadily stealing that throughout the last 700-800 years.
That was the thing that really, it was remarkable to me. I mean, my whole childhood, and I had some pretty good teachers growing up in the schools I went to, and it was the whole idea of the British Empire. And the sun never set on the British Empire. And they were able to take this through, that mercantile mindset and spread it worldwide, right? So you figure, oh my God, they've got this host, they expand it, they've grown it, they've reduced the monarchy, if you will, down to where it's parliamentary and control. And then they spread it through mercantilism. But then how come that, go back to that moment in particular as it relates to England and Britain eventually. How does that collapse then? How does overextending yourself get to the point for the collapse, right? I think it's easy to understand with the Venetians and the Dutch because, as power grew with the Ottomans and in that region, they couldn't defend themselves against the mass of that army or the Dutch have never really been known as this warring people or tribe, right? As
they have,
the early Dutch, right? The Viking Dutch, right?
No. The Dutch East Indies Company and the Dutch under the Dutch East Indies Company were in 30-year war. They backed the 50-year. The Dutch were a very warlike people all over the world. Look at the
they actually provided the soldiers for the sailors.
Yes.
Wow, I didn't know
the Dutch
that. Wow, that's
physically sent the armies to conquer the British in 1688.
Got it. Okay. All right. So with Britain now, them taking over Britain and they're expanding it, growing the empire. How does Britain get to that point? I mean, obviously not everybody, but some people recognize how over leveraged they got in World War I. And then ultimately, World War II is just catastrophic for them.
Okay. So, great question.
Sorry, it's kind of rambling. I just
no. It's a great
so
question.
Much
and
I'm
it's
trying
very important because this is where the U.S. is right now,
right?
Or where they're trying to get us, right? Go back in memory. Right? I don't know many people been to Europe, etc., but I've been all over Europe. I've lived there for a while. People are like, it's London. It's the city of London. It's the Brits. They've been raping and pillaging the world. Okay. You been to Britain? It's pretty poor.
Yeah.
Pretty shabby. Where's all of their old oligarch families? Right? Where's all that wealth? Where's all those stately homes? Where's all the mansions? All those, right? It's all gone. Right? It's all gone. Tenements and trash, and it's in total and absolute decay, collapsing, except certain palaces and monuments, etc.
Right.
Okay, where'd all that wealth go? Went through the city of London to the continent of Europe. Okay. How many times has Europe been rebuilt from basically the ground up in the last 200 plus years?
3 times?
3 times.
Yeah.
Europe, Britain, and the British peoples and the English-speaking peoples have rebuilt the United States or Europe from the ground up 3 times. Right?
Right.
So, okay. To your question, what happens? Look at the United States right now. Since World War I, we've had the highest wealth, there's a bit in the 1800s, et cetera, as there was expansion and growth, et cetera. But we've been, ostensibly the greatest GDP, the greatest productive engine in the world. Have you seen our infrastructure? Have you seen our streets and our cities?
Yes.
Have you seen the debt burdens we have? Where'd all that wealth go? Well, it certainly didn't go to England or Britain, because it's forgive my language, but a shithole too. So where'd it go? Well, Europe looks pretty nice. Europe's pretty beautiful. They don't produce a damn thing. They haven't produced anything in 80 years. Wow. They don't create anything. They don't produce anything. Yes, there's some in German industry, et cetera, but as a continent and as a 700 million people, right? Proportionally, they produce nothing. So how do they look so good? How are they living so well? How do they have these 200-foot freaking yachts? Right. Right? They haven't had empires in forever, and their empires were never much anyways, not compared to the British. So where did the wealth of the last century of the United States go? Where did the wealth of the British Empire for the last 3 centuries plus go? Europe looks pretty nice. And it looks pretty nice for the 3rd time in the last 200 plus years, because it was rebuilt under the Napoleonic era. It was rebuilt after World War I. It was rebuilt again after World War II.
This just hit a whole nother chord. I don't know if you watch Tucker Carlson, but he just had a woman on, Catherine Fritz, who used to be in the government, in the Bush senior government, and she ran kind of the HUD, and she's got this great news site called Solari, and they do these very intense analysis of the economic mismanagement or redirection of economies. And she actually had this really fascinating segment of it where she was saying, and she went back to that famous, September 10th, 2001, where Rumsfeld comes out and says, we're unaccounted for $2.7 trillion. And what she was hinting at or saying is that underneath all these structures, right? I guess those structures of the steps that you were talking about, they're funneling money out of the commoners into these other areas and other places through these different types of systems. So for me, like, as you're saying this, I'm like, whoa, here's a person that was in, and she actually was attacked for 9 years, had to defend herself against the DOJ. They tried to destroy her. She was an investment banker and all this, and they tried to just completely destroy her. And it's like, because she was exposing these hidden secrets of where the money is going and funneling to. And so that kind of brings us up to the modern era, post World War II, after the British host was destroyed and it coming over to New York. And can you just talk, a little bit about that and what you're seeing up until where we're at today and how that works? All right. I hope you're just loving this conversation with EM. I know I am, but I just really want to bring back to the forefront of your mind that we are doing a live motivational event on Patreon on May 31st. That's May 31st on Patreon. I'm going to be giving a live motivational event. I'm going to introduce the whole idea behind performance, how I look at it, how I think about it, and then why I created the frog logic concepts. So join us. At David Rutherford Show is our Patreon account. For $2 a month, jump on. You're going to get this free live motivational event on May 31st.